My name is Ramses Oudt. I am community manager at Logseq. Today I'm joined by Aryan Sawhney, who is a Logseq power user. He's also a very important voice in the Logseq community, being very helpful in the Discord server, on social media, and generally just spreading a lot of knowledge about Logseq. Today, we are going to dive into the basics of Logseq plugin development. Aryan taught himself enough JavaScript in one single weekend to be able to create a plugin that he has been thinking about for quite a while. He will be showing not only how he learned JavaScript, but also do some live coding and basically shows all the basics to get started with Logseq plugin development. This is a recording from a live session. I made the mistake of not recording the introduction during the live session, so you will be seeing somewhere in the middle where Aryan is introducing himself. The rest of the session is recorded, so you only will miss a tiny part of the introduction. If you have any questions about Logseq, Logseq plugin development, or how to make our product better, please drop a comment on YouTube or send me a direct message on Discord. For now, I hope you will learn a lot from this session. I know I definitely did. Enjoy.
It's how I organize my notes. It's how I pretty much stay in touch with everything that's happening at school. And I use it for just planning out plugins, scoping them all, and pretty much everything that I do happens inside Logseq. And so, yeah, that's a bit about me.
Yeah, great to hear that. So you use Logseq for a variety of things. I've seen you use it quite a bit for your schoolwork, and maybe you can tell a little bit how you got into plugin development, because at some point you were using Logseq and you thought, hey, I missed something and I want to create that. So how did you get started with that? And maybe you can tell a little bit how you got started learning enough JavaScript or enough code to be able to create what you wanted to create.
All right. So before Logseq, I was using Aspen's Research. And before that, I was using Notion. And that was pretty much my note-taking stack for 2020. And well, while I do prefer Logseq for like a ton of stuff, I just felt like there was some stuff that some of my previous tools could have did a bit better. And one of those was the templator blocks in Notion, which I really love. It's just really super useful for just like having like organizing things inside a single page and just having repeated entries of one text or usually dynamic blocks. Like in Notion, you could use it for habit tracking and meeting notes, and they're pretty cool. And well, that was just something that was missing. So I've always wanted to contribute to Logseq. And for me, Clojure which is the language that Logseq is programmed in, was a bit daunting. I tried dabbling myself into it a few times and trying to fix a few bugs, but well, it was either the team always fixed those bugs before I got the chance to, or I just couldn't wrap my head around the code base and all that. So making plugins I found like an easier way to contribute things that I want into the Logseq code base and just make it possible for me to do more things than I could previously do inside of Logseq. And that was kind of my inspiration for wanting to create a plugin. And I just felt that I could help other people along the way with the plugin as well. So now when I decided I want to make a plugin, I thought I had to first figure out what was plugins made in. So usually, I went to the Logseq sample plugins repository on GitHub. And that's actually one of the best resources that I'd recommend for learning. And just looked at all the plugins that were made, complete with their source code and all. And I just started looking at those and looking at plugins over there. and I just found one that was pretty close to what I wanted. It was the Pomodoro timer plugin, and I thought of using that as a base for my idea of a plugin, which was a templater plugin. So I looked through the code and I realized that it was made in JavaScript. I understood like a bit about the tech stack and understood like how you did stuff. Most of this was from looking at an existing plugin and just identifying and trying to piece together what happened when and what each line of code did. So I kind of just looked at it like as sort of a pseudocode. I didn't know any JavaScript back then, so I was just like looking through it. And well, I never actually, and now when it came to actually applying it to my own plugin, I didn't actually know where to start. Like I didn't have any experience with JavaScript at all. And even my web development in general, I had uh, maybe 2 hours worth of HTML and CSS from when I was in middle school. That was pretty much it.
Mm.
So, and I also, but at the same time, I knew Swift as well, which was pretty somewhat, the syntax was fairly similar to JavaScript, not extremely so, but enough that I could get the gist of what was happening. And that's kind of where I started. So,
So you already knew Swift, so you already knew basically the basics of programming, or was programming in itself also quite new for you?
I knew the basics by then. Like I knew what a function was, like, and I knew
Mm-hmm.
what variables were. I knew the different data types, and that was. But I wasn't really experienced like advanced or anything in any of those, and I still wouldn't say I am right now. But I, I believe that you don't need to know everything. You just need to know enough that you can actually do what you want to do with it, and then start going there.
I think that's a great lesson. I think that's even if you don't code, that's even a good lesson if you use Logseq itself, because I hear so many people who say, "Oh, I first need to do a course, or I first need to know everything about this tool or this language, programming language, before I can do something." And I think that is what keeps many people in tutorial hell, as it's called in the coding community, where you just go from tutorial to tutorial to tutorial. Maybe you are building stuff, but it's not, maybe it's probably not things that you want to build, because it's just part of the tutorial or the course. Whereas you started out by having a use case, functionality that you saw that you wanted to copy into Logseq, not have to wait for the Logseq team to create it, and then just started out by reading the code and trying to explain to yourself, if I understand correctly,
Yeah.
line by line, what each line did. So you knew the basics of what a function was, what a variable was, data types, which is very basic. You could learn that maybe in an afternoon if you have some tutorial. And then you just went line by line using the sample plugin, explaining to yourself, this is what it does. And now that the teacher in me is coming up, I think this is also the mark of the best learners. So the best learners have some kind of inner dialogue going on. So when you look at some kind of information, and you, instead of just looking at it and taking it in, you basically wrestle with the idea or the concept, and you try to explain to yourself what something does. And especially in area of code, it's very useful to just look at a piece of code and then explain to yourself, what does everything do? And then at some point you will see something you don't understand, some function. And that's where basically I think you would go onto Google, then figure out more. It's like it's a messy process, right? Learning to code, you go back and forth using Google, and then see how you can apply something. Is that correct, or do you have a different approach?
A lot of what I was doing was actually just Googling, but at the same time, I was just playing around with the plugin. Like I was figuring out what happens if I delete this function? What happens when I change this text? Is this text reflected on the actual user interface that's being seen in Logseq? Like what does
Mm.
changing this do? And that just helped me get an idea of what each thing was doing, what each thing was changing, and how, if I wanted to change this plugin into something that I wanted, how would I go about it? And that was actually how I started. I just started with the base of that plugin and then just started sort of adding on to that plugin. And I just like deleted the non-essential functions and I just used that as a base, just as a starter.
Mm.
And then
I think that's a great advice. I think that's great advice. So instead of starting from scratch, and I think that's also why many people are afraid to start coding and they start with courses and tutorials. If you just take something existing, start playing with it, changing it, and start making bigger and bigger changes, that's also a way to get started learning about something. And you say it yourself, you don't understand everything, but it works. And that is, in the beginning, that is basically what you want, is just create something that works. Maybe the code is not the cleanest or the best, or maybe it's not even the safest, but you start to play. You start to play with the code. You start to see what is possible, and as you play, as you change, basically be a hacker, you learn more and more, and you learn the implications of when you change something. I think that's an awesome approach. And basically, as the plugins are, the Logseq plugins are all open source, you can basically just get started taking an existing plugin. So for example, take your smart blocks plugin, add something that they want, and then use your plugin as the foundation. They don't need to start from scratch. They can just get a code base, change a few things, change the behavior to your liking, and then have your ideal plugin. So I think that's a great way to get started. Do you have some resources that you can point to, or was it all just Googling, putting a function into into Google and then just searching for it? What have you used to learn more, to be able to create your first plugin?
There's quite a few. Well, most of what I was doing was just based on just Googling what I could and figuring that out. I used a lot of Stack Overflow and all for like random like function names that I didn't know what it did. And at the same time, there was like one or two resources in particular. One was actually just javascript.com. They have like a quick like 5-minute entry point into JavaScript, and that was kind of my starting point, really. I'll link it. So that kind of I just followed the tutorial there. It told me what a function was, how to call a function, and really that's actually the basics of what I learned. The rest was actually mostly carried forward from like me knowing already a bit about Python and a bit about Swift. And that just helped me understand like how to frame my thinking. So I could write the pseudocodes already. I just need to translate them into JavaScript. And a lot of the code that I actually first wrote was, first I wrote something in, say, Swift, and then I translate that to JavaScript, because I didn't think in JavaScript until quite some time into it, like maybe a few weeks it took me before I actually started thinking in JavaScript. And yeah, really just understanding like the basics of the language, and this is a great link for just getting that basic introduction. And for a bit more advanced, like there's the Odin project, which I've heard good things about, and I'm actually doing it right now. And yeah, those are my main recommendations.
Yeah. So to recap, it's not necessary to have a lot of experience, but you do need to know the basics of how code is run. So what is a function? What is a loop? Read up on those, like core concepts. And I think maybe it will be interesting if I organize a session about that later, on how to basically get started with that way of thinking. But then it doesn't matter. I think, as most programmers would know, it doesn't really matter if you don't know a language yet. You can just learn it. And I think pseudocode, so for people who have zero experience, look online for a pseudocode and see if you can find some resources that will help you learn this more algorithmic way of thinking, so the way computers work, and that you at least know the concepts of function, variables, loops, stuff like that. Just the basics, so you know what they do, and then how to actually create them. That is something you can then figure out. And but just being aware of those concepts, and then going through example code and just explaining to yourself what it does, so you can say, oh, this is a variable, and then you just check. You put part of that code into Google to check if you're right. So you're basically testing yourself, where you say, oh, this is a while loop that I see now. And then you just check yourself if that's correct, and try to explain the individual parts of a function or a loop to yourself and what it does at each point. I think that's a good start. Can you maybe show something, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Can you maybe show something how you get started with basically how you set up your environment to get started? Because you have created a GitHub template that people can use.
Yeah.
And then maybe you can give a little bit of a live demo as you were planning.
All right, sure. So I've just resent it on the chat in case anyone's missed it. And I guess I'll just share my screen now. And let's just start right at the template in GitHub. So this is the template which you all should be able to see if you click the link. And well, there's a few ways that you can go about it. One, you can just download the template, or you can use this template by clicking the use this template button. Let's just stick with downloading it as a zip for now. And I believe I already have it on my desktop. Just open it, unzip it, yeah. And then I've got it right here. So the IDE that I use, which is like the developer environment that I use, like how I go about coding, is I use Visual Studio Code. It's free and you can download it online. It's by Microsoft, and it works pretty well, and lots of professionals use it. So I just open it up. It looks like I already have it open. And then just drag the folder into Visual Studio Code. Trust the authors, well, if you want to. And then, yeah, this is the screen that you're greeted with. Now, of course, this may seem a bit daunting, but let's just quickly look through everything that's in this template. So this .github folder is just something that's used for publishing your plugin. It's not anything important right now. We might get into it later. But the real important thing is 3 files. Each Logseq plugin has to have 3 files. First is this index.html file, which is if you have any knowledge about web development, it's what calls the plugin. It's like the entry point of the plugin into the app. And as you can see, the next big important file is index.js, and this is where the actual code in your plugin is located. So I already have some sample code, and what this function does, and I'll just explain it in a second, is that it inserts 5 random blocks into the page, and I'll demonstrate it as well. And then the final most important file is the package.json file. And this just has data like name, version, description, and all this. And at the same time, there's also a pretty important thing, which is scripts. And you don't really need to do anything about it at the moment. Like when you first get into Logseq, you don't need to do anything here. Just like pretty much just use this package.json file as sort of a boilerplate, and just like, change the name or something. And you can leave the rest alone essentially. So let's call this, let's just call this Logseq test plugin. Yeah. Right, I think that's everything.
Could you make the text a little bit bigger?
Yeah.
Yes,
better?
Perfect. Thank you. Yes,
right.
Perfect. Thanks.
Great. All right, so now that we just set up the package.json file, and this is just sort of what configures the plugin. So you can put dependencies here. So like in case you want to use a third-party library, you can add it here. And you can have, well, in JavaScript, typically dependencies, or JavaScript, usually when you're developing plugins with it, you have to compile the code first. And Actually, I'll just show you like right from the start. So I've already got some code here, right here and here. So I've already got this function here, and so now in order to run this, you have to essentially, okay, I just need to get this out of the way. So you have to open a new terminal window, and there's two essential commands that you need to know for developing plugins. The first one is just simply yarn. And what this command does is that it essentially fetches all dependencies. So you may notice this import statement at the top, import at logseq /libs. What this statement does is that it basically tells the plugin that to import this set of libraries or the set of commands that allow you to interface with Logseq. So inside of these, there are like functions like inserting blocks, showing messages and all. But the first step is always to import this. So in order to, with JavaScript, you can't just write an empty, naked import statement. The first thing you have to do is actually install this thing into your machine so that the app knows, so that Logseq knows how to run this. So you run yarn, and what this does is it fetches these dependencies. So it fetches this library and basically goes to the package manager or just goes online and downloads this interfacer. And you just wait for this to happen. And then the next step is to do yarn build, which is what you use to basically create actually executable plugin. So when you run yarn build, you just wait for it to run, and then you'll see a dist folder be added. And having this dist folder means that Logseq can now read your plugin. So if I were to go into Logseq right now, test over here, some test items here. So I'll start by going to plugins and first installing this plugin that's already been, installing this template plugin that we've already created. So I'll go by clicking load unpack plugin. In order to develop plugins, you have to first ensure that you're in developer mode. So you go to settings, and then just go to advanced and enable developer mode. So once you've done this, you can go to plugins and you can add manually unpacked plugins. So you just navigate your way to this folder over here, Logseq starter plugins template, and I can just drag it from desktop. And as you can see, we have this Logseq test plugin right over here. Great. So now when we load it, we know that there's this one function that's called insert blocks, and that's kind of what we expect to happen. So let me just walk you through the code as it is right now. So there's this function over here that's insert some blocks. So what this does is, I'll just walk you line by line. Okay, so I'll first start with this last line, which is the first one that's actually executed. So every plugin should have this line at the end of the code. And what this does is it runs the code that's inside this function over here. And when you run Logseq for the first time, actually, let me just open the console first. You can see this plugin loaded message right over here. I should probably zoom in a bit. You can see plugin loaded right over here. And this is basically over here, you've written console.log plugin loaded, which basically means that when you started the plugin for the first time, when you just launched Logseq, and when I just installed the plugin, you saw this message being loaded, which means that Logseq has just run this command and has done what's over here. So now the first line is console.log plugin loaded, but the second is logseq.editor.register/command. What this line does is that it adds a slash command, which, as you know, it would be just slash. And the slash command, I have to first refresh in order for it to show up. So the slash command is called insert blocks. So I'll go insert blocks. And when I click it, I get these 5 messages and I get 5 blocks being printed. And what this does is that's pretty much essentially what's happening in this plugin at the moment. So let me just walk you through line by line. So when Logseq starts, it performs this line. So after this line occurs, it runs this function over here. And the first line over here is to log plugin loaded into the console. And if you see the console, you can see somewhere on the top, you should be seeing plugin loaded. Now the next line that will be run is this logseq.editor.register/command. And what this line does is that it essentially adds this to the slash menu. Now, after this, you see that there's inside these curly braces, you have this function call, insert some blocks. And what this does is that it basically passes in a command to Logseq to insert some blocks. So basically, when you call this slash command and you click insert blocks, it calls this function right over here. And this function right over here is just a reference to this function call is a reference to this function over here. And basically what's happening is that when you insert the slash command, this function is actually the one that's being called. And the first thing that's occurring is that it's logging to the console, or sort of printing in most languages you call it. It prints it prints open the calendar, and you can find that if I right over here, open the calendar. And after that, it creates an array and then loops through that array and prints the message and shows the message function has been run 5 times because there are 5 items in this array. And as you can see, when I insert blocks, you get this message 5 times. And you also get 5 blocks that are generated, which occurs because this loop is repeated 5 times. And right over here, what happens is that the Logseq app is inserting at the block that is being called. So think of E as the block that's being called. So when you pass in E to the function, it basically passes in some properties of the block from which it's being called. Now, this probably isn't something that you need to know at the moment, but essentially this is how the plugin works. So there are 3 main stages. First is this being called. Then you have this function being run and this slash command being registered. And anytime now when the app is running and you insert the slash command, insert blocks, it will call this function once, and this function basically adds 5 blocks, pretty much. I hope this is clear. And and now let's go on to, let's actually make a plugin now. So right from the scratch, I'll show you how I'd go about making it. So let's make a plugin and off the top of my head, let's make a plugin that converts the case. So takes all the content into the block and quite simply makes it uppercase. Is that simple enough? So I guess what we're trying to show here is so this is what we want finally. We want that when you right click this block, you will have the option to make the block uppercase. And when you click it, it should change the block to uppercase. Now I've already made a plugin that does this, So we're just going to create a slightly toned down version of that plugin that hopefully gets you familiar with how to go about making plugins. So I'll just turn off all my existing plugins that I have enabled, except for the one that we're working on right now, right here, and just refresh. So first off, let's figure out what has to be done. So the first step that we have to do when we think about it is, let's actually delete all this code, except let's delete this function over here because that's not important at the moment. So this is all the code that we have, essentially, and we can also delete this. So essentially what's happened, and we also don't need this, right? So this is like the true base of the plugin, and this is truly like everything that you need just to get started. So you have this import statement at the top, you have this main function in the middle, and you have this call that basically calls this function upon Logseq being started. So the first thing that we have to do is add an item to this menu called make text uppercase. So going here, let's first add that. So the way if you want to interact with Logseq, once you install this library at logseq/libs, once you've installed this library, you are now able to tap into Logseq. So by typing Logseq dot, you now have like a ton of methods and sort of features that you can use to interact with Logseq. And looks like I'm getting a question, what is the catch method? So think of the catch method as in the case that something goes wrong, and let's say Logseq is unable to start the plugin, it catches an error, and the catch basically is used to return an error in the case that this is unsuccessful. That's sort of what it does.
Yeah, and also if you want to have some documentation about the methods, the functions, you can go to logseq.github.io/plugins, and we'll talk a little bit more about the documentation in a bit. But that's basically the core documentation that describes the possibilities of this Logseq library, right? That you import at the beginning.
Pretty much, yeah. Right, so let's start by registering that right-click menu bar item. So to do that, you tap into Logseq, which is like this entire thing. You type in Logseq and then use a dot to tap into the methods inside of Logseq. Now, autocomplete okay, I'm not sure why it didn't autocomplete there. Right, so Logseq dot. And now over here, you can find basically all the features that the library that you imported at the top has to offer. And these are all the ways that you can interact with Logseq. So let's start so now if we want to add the item to the menu bar, you go to logseq.app, I believe. Okay, just go back. You go to logseq.app and then register, I believe it's register. Let's actually start by creating a slash menu. So simply do /uppercase should make the text into uppercase. So to that, we quite simply just do logseq.app.register. Logseq.register.
I think it's editor.
Yeah. Logseq.app. Not here. Not here either.
Wasn't it in editor?
Yeah, that's where it was. Even I'm still learning and keep forgetting this. And it's always handy to have the documentation in a
And here,
site.
I think you also see the context menu that you were looking for.
Yeah. So let's actually just do context menu first. So right here, when you do this, you get the option to, when you call this function, you have to add parentheses next to it. And Visual Studio Code is pretty nice in that it like gives you context as to what you're supposed to do at what point. So what I do is right over here, you can see tag string. So you start by adding like the tag is used for showing where exactly you want the function to be called. So you'd use it when you'd use the tag when saying where do you want the menu to be shown. I'll just bring up on the side an example of, yeah, I'm always referring to old plugins that I've already made or existing plugins. And right now, instead of this, I'll actually just copy paste the absolute starting code of a blank function. So this is essentially how it should be looking like. So I'll just walk you through this statement so far. So the first statement is logseq.editor.register block context menu. And then next thing that you have to do is just add like the text for what you want the menu item to show. So in this case, we want to show make block uppercase. And then next is sort of like a callback. It's called the callback. And over here, it's essentially showing what should be happening after the register block context menu item has been called. So, and Ben gives the reminder that you should probably add a wait at the start because this returns a callback, but at the moment probably isn't too important right now, but is a good practice to have. So right over here, you have the option to make the block uppercase, and then, so that's the name of the thing. And then over here, you have what should be done when you call the function. What should be done when you click make block uppercase in the menu. So let's first walk through the problem. So what we have to do and think through it logically. Okay, let's just write over here. So let's just write the first few steps that we need to do. So the first thing that needs to be done is that you have to get the content of the block, because in order to sort of first make the block's content uppercase, you first need to know what the block has in it. So first is get the block's content. Next, you have to not change the content to uppercase, but what you have to do is actually, I'll probably change the content to uppercase. So you change the blocks. So once you've got the block and you've changed the block's content to uppercase, next step to do is to change the original block's content back to uppercase now. And let's just have it as the third thing that save the block, the third thing that needs to happen. So let's just add this to inside the function. So essentially what we have over here is that 3 comments for, okay, I'll just close the sidebar.
Basically, you have started with the starting point. So how do you trigger the plugin using the context menu? So that's basically your starting point. And once you have that starting point to trigger the plugin, you first write the pseudocode to describe basically the steps that the plugin has to take, right?
Pretty much, yeah. And then
that's a good process.
Is to actually convert this and write the functions to make this happen. So when we want to get the block's content, the first thing that we have to do is essentially to ask Logseq to give you the content of the existing block. So right over here, we're already being passed E as a, and what this is that it's basically just a variable that we're getting access to when we call this block context menu item. So think of it as, so what this basically just gives you is the UUID of the block that's just being called. Now, Logseq, Logseq, if you know already, the way it works is that each block has its own ID, and that's how block references work. So this UUID is the same thing that happens when you I'll just bring up Logseq. Same thing that happens when you just copy block ref. This ID over here is what the UUID is. So now when you call the function, this UUID is already being, this UUID is already being given to you. So now if you want, now Logseq has the Logseq libs over here. It has a function that allows you to get a block. So logseq.editor.get block. And now what this allows you to do is, now with this, I should probably turn off auto completion, which I'm not sure how to do. Right. So now what I have to do is, so now when I hover over this, it gives me what all stuff needs to be given, like what does this function take in and what does it return. So as you can see here, it takes in an SRC block number. It takes in a block identity, which is basically a UUID. So, and yeah, that's the main thing that it takes in. So the way we can get it is by tapping into E over here, which has been sent into the function. So we just type in e.uuid. And this over here allows you to, this basically has granted you access to the UUID of the block. And at this stage, let's actually just print it to the console. And let's actually just test what we have over here. Actually, let's test e.uuid and see what happens, just to make sure that it lines up correctly. So I'll open Logseq now. So first thing you have to do, of course, is that now that you've made these changes, you have to compile the plugin. So you do that by, like I mentioned at the start, you have to type in yarn build. Every time that you make a change, you type this in so that it sort of becomes recompiled and that Logseq can now read the changes that you've made. So now we go here, just turn these off, and then just reload the plugin to reload the changes. And now what, and I'll also just restart the app because we added a new context menu. So now that we've got this, let's just right-click the thing and then make block uppercase. And yeah, and now I'll go to the console via Command Option I. And right over here, you can see the UUID of the block has been printed to the console. So at least that's a start. Now we know that this function is working properly. And this is actually the first thing that I do whenever I'm having trouble with anything, is that I make sure that I know what's happening at each stage. And it's a good practice to have, just to keep testing that everything is going like it should be, that e.uuid is in fact returning the UUID. So now we can just probably remove this by now. So now we've already got the block, but just getting the block doesn't do anything. You have to actually assign it to a variable so that you can store it, essentially, so that you can access the block. So to do that, you just use the constant keyword in JavaScript, which is similar in other languages to the let keyword, and it's just basically defining a constant. So constant, and let's call this current block, and then just add an equal sign. Now, if we try and let's say print, I'm logging into console, let's see what happens. And make sure you write yarn build and make sure you save the file before making the changes. Let's go back. TP to toggle the plugins view, and then just reload this plugin. And now let's try and see if the changes occur. So I'll right-click the bullet, make block uppercase, and let's see. Now, contrary to what you might have expected, like, I don't know, the block to actually show. Instead, we got something called a promise. Now, a promise is just a concept in JavaScript that's basically saying that sometimes it has to do with sometimes functions run asynchronously, in that it's like it runs at the same time as because Logseq does not necessarily give you the block immediately. You have to wait for the block to come because, well, there's always like database is not instant in retrieving the data. And because of this, you have to add the await keyword whenever you're interacting with the database. Like let's say whenever you're passing a query on, whenever you're getting a block, you always have to add await keyword. So when you do this now and add yarn build, and then let's just reload this. And now let's try making it uppercase. We can see that we actually get sort of an, I should probably zoom this in a bit. You can see that we get like this thing over here, which is basically all the properties of the block. And if you want to just verify this, you can always just right click it and then show block data. And you should see that these items over here line up almost exactly. Yeah. And now this is the first stage of, so now great. Now we've got the block. And now if we look closely at the block, and what we want is the content of the block. And as you can see here, there's a property called content of this current block. And now if we want to get the content, we have to tap into the block. The way we do that is using a dot. In JavaScript, using a dot is the most simple way to tap into something of a, tap into a property of another item. So right over here, we can tap into content. So now it's actually, now we've got this console.log statement that essentially prints the current block's content. Now I run that. I've run the build command. Now I've reloaded the plugin. And now let's see what happens. Now when we make the block uppercase, we get the actual content of the block. Yippee. Now the next stage, and now I think we've got the first stage pretty much cleared up. Next thing we have to do is change the content of the block to uppercase. Now, JavaScript actually has its own inbuilt method called toUppercase. And I'll just write toUppercase JavaScript, just type it into Alfred, right? And if you look at right here, you can see you can use simply two sentence, like you can just tap into a variable and then just type in toUppercase, and then the new variable becomes uppercase. Pretty cool. And I always like have some sort of documentation open at the side so that I can easily refer to existing code, because it's even the best developers can't memorize everything from heart. They all have to refer to something. And that's why I just like to Google whenever I'm unsure about something. I just use Stack Overflow, Mozilla.org, or W3 Schools, all great websites. Right, so now that we've got this, so now let's actually create something called constant current block text equals current block dot content. This is just so that we can easily access the content of the block like we printed previously. And this just makes it easier to change the content to uppercase. So now let's just create a new variable called constant uppercase text equals, and we want it to be equal to the current block text, the same value as current block text, but uppercase. So we just do current block text dot uppercase to uppercase. Just add these closing brackets. And now let's just test out what we get. And just for the sake of it, we'll also write the lowercase, like the actual current block text, so like the existing ones, just so that we can see what's happening. So I'll run yarn build, open Logseq, reload the plugin, and now let's try make block uppercase. See, yippee, now it's working. So now we've officially got the contents of the block and we've changed it to uppercase. What's the last step that we have to do is, well, now we have to actually update this block's content. Now, in this case, I'm just like wondering, how do I do that? So now this might be a time to check out the documentation. So I'll just Google Logseq, logseq.github.io. I think that's what it was. Logseq.github.io/plugins. Yep. And this is the plugin documentation. It's definitely not the most easy to use, and at times it can be a bit difficult to read, and it isn't the most detailed, but it shows it pretty good, pretty easily shows you like what it has. So now over here, I'll try and figure out if there's a way that I can find the update the block. And from the looks of it, looks like there isn't. So now what would I do in this case that I couldn't find something in the documentation, but I'm pretty sure that it should exist somewhere. Now, another like really nice resource that I found is just is actually by going into the source code. So now this may seem a bit daunting at first, but it's not that difficult. So what I do in these cases that I want to figure out like where is this function, like how do I find this function? So I'll actually just send the link to this on the chat and this file. So you can find this in the main Logseq repository. But there's just this file called lsplugin.ts, and this has pretty much all the methods that you have access to. And now over here, you can see like pretty much is super wordy. So I'll just use Command F and search for update or whatever. And it looks like there is a function to update a block. Pretty cool. Now let's try that. So now looks like there exists a function called Logseq, called update the block. So now we go to tap into Logseq and hope that autocomplete here helps us. So Logseq dot, let's first try to figure out if there's an update here. There's an update settings, but no update block. So that's probably not where we're supposed to be finding them. Next, let's just go to editor because that just makes the most sense. So editor dot, and over here you can see a new list of functions, and this might be easier for some people, but let's just type in update, and it looks like there is an option to update a block. Great, I think this might be what we're looking for. So now let's just call it and see what it's asking us for. Looks like it's asking us for the block UUID of the thing we want to change. So in this case, I guess it's asking us for e.uuid. And in this case, it's also probably a good practice to sort of assign e.uuid as sort of a block UUID equals e.uuid, just to make it less wordy and easier to refer to. So I'll just replace e.uuid with that. Now these all serve the same purpose essentially, but this is just easier to read. So now we've got this, and what else is it asking us for? It's asking us to specify the content or the string that we want to change it to. So now we've already got the string that we want to change it to is uppercase text, right? So now we just type in here uppercase text, save it, and now let's test it out. Yarn build. Oops. This is just an error. If you get this error, know that it doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong with your code. It's just something wrong just occurred randomly. And often just typing yarn build again fixes it. So now let's reload this plugin. Great. Now let's right click it, make block uppercase, and boom.
Yay. Nice. That's amazing. I feel looking at you that I now know how to build plugins. Although obviously there's enough to learn. So a few things that I observed that I think would be best practices, and maybe I'm just saying things that are completely obvious to the people in the call here. But what you did was you used the autocomplete of Visual Studio Code quite a bit. So you load it in the library, and then basically the autocomplete of Visual Studio Code gives you already a lot of paths to look for things to do. Combined with the documentation, and I agree, the documentation could be way clearer. So if anyone has an idea, please just put it in the chat. And then what I also liked about your approach is that you didn't just build everything in one go. You took little steps. So you first looked, okay, can I actually get the block ID? And then you print it to the console. So you use the console quite a bit. For new coders, I think this is one of the core things to keep in mind. Write some pseudocode like you did, which will also document basically your code, what it does, using comments. And then take step by step and check after every step if the code is doing what you expect it to do. So this is a really good way to learn to code, because if you use the console, you basically get very quick feedback. And the way to learn quickly is to get feedback quickly to see how you're doing. And I think that is the main takeaway. We are on top of the hour. I don't know if you have a little bit more time to go into some questions that might be popping up in the chat. And maybe in the meanwhile, as I'm looking at the chat, maybe you can also, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but maybe you can also give some suggestions on how to improve the documentation. Because when I look at the documentation, and I'm not a coder, I am overwhelmed. I have no idea what to do. So, but I cannot put exactly my finger on what we should improve. So do you have some ideas what we could do better in the documentation?
Well, the first thing I'd suggest is sort of adding like in plain English. First off, I'd say like have some documentation about the functions and just like sort of make it like easier to understand, like sort of be friendly and all, like use friendly language, and just sort of like guide people through, like sort of have like a walkthrough, like maybe give an example of each function being used. That just kind of to me seems like that makes
Yeah.
sense.
So basically, if just summing up the functions, methods, also give examples
Yeah.
of how it's actually used. All right. Let's see some other questions. I always get questions about the recording. Yes, the session is recorded. Yes, I will share the recording. No worries if you have to drop off. Question from Sarafanan, and I got that via direct message. And he says, or she says, I see you're using a Mac, Yarn and Yarn bolt commands. Will they also work on Windows if you use Visual Studio Code on Windows? Do the same commands work?
They will absolutely work on Windows. And one thing that you have to make sure is that Yarn and Yarn build aren't actually inbuilt commands, and you actually have to install npm for that to occur. And this is probably something that I skipped out on earlier. And I should probably link like a quick page on how to install npm and JavaScript, as that's pretty important. Not sure why I missed that. Just kind of assumed it, I guess. And yeah.
So there is, let me see, also some documentation about what you will need to build a plugin. And it's basically, I think you can use, so you can use your template, but you will need to install some things before you get started, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Template should cover most of it, but these are the two important things. This is the important thing that you have to have before. Only real dependency.
Yeah, so it also says so on the, let's see, on the following page. So this is basically the README of the sample plugin, and it also explains that you first need to have Node and npm or Yarn installed on your system. So just follow the instructions for your operating system. On Mac and Linux, I think it's quite easy to install. Also, if you're on Mac, you can use Homebrew. I think there's an equivalent for Windows, but I'm blanking on the name for package control. Let's see, from Linjen, there's a question, and he or she is asking, I am wondering why const variables are frequently used. Is const preferred? Why not simply use let or var? I don't know if this is a whole discussion that's now going to get triggered.
Even I like recently learned, I mean, this is probably one of the first things that you should be learning, but I learned it like pretty recently. and I learned the difference pretty recently. So const is probably the recommended one that you should be doing. And it's really it's kind of recommended whenever you don't need anything special. So var is used when you want to mutate, if you want to change the value of a function of a variable, and we didn't need to do any of that in this plugin, which is why I use const. And const is just preferred to let, unless you want to use a special property of let over constant, because constant is just like what it should be. It's like the basic, and that's the most efficient performance wise, I believe.
All right, cool. I don't know if you can answer this question, but P is asking, when I look at the plugins on GitHub, a lot of them use TypeScript. Is there any benefit of using TypeScript over JavaScript?
Well, I'm not really familiar with this too much. Like I just use really either of them. I just interchange them. So they're both essentially the same thing, but TypeScript it's helpful in some niche cases. And well, it's probably easier to get started in JavaScript, but as that's sort of the first thing that you get, but it's pretty easy to create a project in TypeScript as well. Just go to, actually, I'll just show you right here. Just go to sidebar, just go to index.html, change this to index.ts, and change the title of index.js to index.ts. And that's really all you need. But overall, unless you have a specific need for something in TypeScript, there's no need to use TypeScript over JavaScript.
Probably if you know TypeScript, you will know what use cases to use TypeScript over JavaScript. So if you're a beginner, just get started with JavaScript. So let's recap and let me share my screen if you're okay with it. So we talked about how you learn to code. We scoped the functionality of a plugin, basically writing pseudocode, and how do you use inspiration. Well, you shared your story of taking Notion as a starting point for button. Then you saw Rome smart blocks, and you thought, this is cool. I'm going to expand my plugin, but basically writing pseudocode. Writing pseudocode, even if you're not interested in plugin development, although I wouldn't know why you would sit here for an hour, but it even works for writing queries, I've noticed. So when I write a query and I look for data in my Logseq graph, I write a little bit of pseudocode instead of writing the query right away. We saw how you started with the set up the environment. I'm going to create a clip out of that so people can rewatch that. And then how to best read and learn from the Logseq API documentation. Oh, first comment is we can improve the documentation using more examples or adding more examples. And what I found very interesting is that you use the autocomplete functionality of Visual Studio Code, which I think is very useful. Best resources for beginners to get started coding. So javascript.com. You mentioned Mozilla, developer documentation, Stack Overflow. Basically, just Googling.
Just Googling. And if you want to do a course, then I recommend the Odin project.
The Odin project. Great. So that is basically best resources for beginners to start coding. The question, should you learn HTML, CSS before JavaScript if you make Logseq plugins? I didn't see you use any HTML or JavaScript. So you take basically an input, a block, and you spit out an output. No HTML, CSS needed for that.
Unless you want to make a use case for your plugin, you don't need HTML or CSS.
Yeah. We didn't get to cover plugins that import exports data. I think that's a little bit of a niche, more of a niche use case, although definitely useful, but we focus now on how to do stuff within Logseq, that the data stays within Logseq. And looking at what you were doing, you didn't write any closure. You didn't even need to know any closure. So I think we covered that. There is also this thing called ClojureScript, which is basically, and I'm out of my depth here, but it's, if I'm correct, it's a like a
It
flavor of
compiles,
JavaScript for
compiles to
Clojure?
JavaScript. So JavaScript, like any that you can use ClojureScript where you would use JavaScript. So you could,
Okay. So you
yeah,
write Clojure, but when you compile it, it becomes JavaScript basically.
essentially at the basic level, yeah, that's pretty much.
All
And
right.
so that means that you can actually code plugins using ClojureScript if that's your preferred language.
All right. Perfect. Again, if you know Clojure, you will probably know if you want to use Clojure scripts or not. I think we covered everything. I think I definitely know where to get started now. I was very lost when I first saw the documentation. And even though I agree with you and I think we should improve it with examples, just seeing how you use the autocomplete and then how you basically dig further and you just experiment. So you're not afraid of not knowing, you just experiment and see what are the outcomes step by step. So for me, that is my main takeaway. Um, I see there's still over 40 people called in. So I don't know if there are any questions for Sani or for us, the Logseq team. Please drop it in the chat. Um, to close off everything, I will be editing this recording. I messed up and I forgot to record the intro, so we'll re-record that, and then hopefully beginning next week, you'll be getting an email with a link to the recording, and a list of resources will also be in the YouTube description. Let's see there is if there are any questions. So Wilson is asking, is there any group of Logseq devs, another site besides of GitHub? If you go to the Discord server, there's a plugins category, and there's a channel with announcements of plugin updates. There's a channel where you can ask questions to plugin developers. There is a channel for plugin developers to ask each other questions. So you can learn a lot from the Discord, I think, if you have questions. Sani is also super responsive there. So that is always great. And then someone is saying that they couldn't find any videos on YouTube about Logseq plugin development. That's why we're doing this session, and this will be on YouTube, so no worries. People are asking where they can follow you on social media. So you're active, I think, on Twitter. You also
Yeah.
have a YouTube channel. Maybe you can put the links also in the chat, so I can put that in the description as well. All right. And Julien is asking, can we do this type of event again? If you know how to make plugins, send me a DM and we're going to do a session like this. So, and I forgot to say this in the intro, which is good that I should re-record it. But the plan is to have live session every Wednesday. So I am doing Workflow Wednesdays. I know it's a cheesy title, but every Wednesday I am going to invite someone to show their workflow. So in this case, it was a little bit outside of Logseq. Next week, and I'm going to post the link in the chat as well. We have Cara Antonaccio or Nacho. Yeah, I think Cara. Please correct me if I'm wrong. If I say it wrong, but we have a session about basically using Logseq for research, and you can register for that event, and I've put the link in the chat. What else? Yeah, so that's next week, Wednesday, and that session will start next week in 45 minutes from now. So it's now 3:15 where I am at. So it will be at 4. What else? Nothing from my side. Aryan, do you have any last thoughts? I think you have put you've put your socials in the chat, which is great.
And well, I guess as homework, I kind of want everyone to Just come up with a grievance that you have about Logseq or some plugin that you're jealous of another tool having, and just try and see what you can see if you can do something about it using plugins. Just try and find a pain point and try and just dive into creating one. That's honestly the best way to learn how to code, and that's what I recommend all of you do.
Yes, scratch your own itch. I think that's the perfect advice. Uh, Go to the Logseq Discord, go to plugins developers channel if you need any help. But yeah, again, we'll be sending out all the links, all the resources that were mentioned in the chat and during the call today. I just want to thank everyone for being here live, helping each other in the chat, asking questions, making it difficult for us so we can keep learning and improving the Logseq experience, and also the plugin creation experience, which I think is super important. Again, what Aryan said in the beginning of this call, it's so great if you can create your own plugin and you don't need to wait for the developers to create some kind of functionality. And what we've already seen is that some of the functionality that first originated in plugins were adopted by the team in the core product. So you can help us basically out making Logseq better for yourself and for others. If there are no more questions in the chat, I am going to stop the recording. I'm going to thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you next week with Kara, who is going to tell us everything about her research workflow using Logseq and adjacent tools and plugins. So until then, hope to see you in the Discord. Don't never hesitate to send me a DM, and have a great day.